Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll make a start. So thanks so much for coming. So this is a online seminar on behalf of the Centre for Gender Studies at Lancaster University. I'm Laura, I'm one of the co-directors of the centre. We do these seminars, we try and do a couple a term. It's been a bit slow this year, it's been quite hard to schedule them, but there will hopefully be some more coming up where we kind of invite different interesting people to come and talk about their research in different contexts. And if anyone's got any recommendations for other people they might like to hear or yourselves, do let us know and we can get in touch and organise that. So today, you will notice we're already recording. We're going to put this on our YouTube afterwards for anyone who can't attend. And you can hopefully turn the subtitles on if you need them with the little 3 dots at the top. There should be a drop-down menu and it'll give you subtitles if you want them. So we're going to have a presentation for about 40 minutes-ish and then questions, Q&A at the end for about 20 minutes-ish. You can feel free to put your camera and mic on if you want to ask your question, or you can put it in the chat during or at the end, and I'll keep an eye on that. So today we're really pleased to have Aerin Lai here, who's a PhD researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and their research focuses on the production of masculinity in Singapore through a decolonial and intersectional perspective, and that's what they're going to speak to you today. So I'll let you go. Shout me if you need me, and then in about 40 minutes we'll come back for questions.
Thank you. Hi everyone for coming for my presentation. I'm just going to very quickly share my slides. Just give me a moment. Right. So can people see my slides?
Yes, that's fine.
Good, thank you. Yeah, so before I get into my presentation, I just very quickly wanted to say thank you to the Center of Gender Studies for having me today, and especially to Laura for inviting me to talk about my research. Yeah, so I'm just going to get started. Right, so these are my research questions. How do Singaporean men construct their masculinity in their everyday lives? How do such constructions of masculinity interact with citizenship-making practices? And how would a decolonial intersectional framework understand such interactions between everyday masculinities and citizenship? So currently sorry, I just realized that it's not the full screen. Yeah, okay, sorry. So currently I am still writing up my dissertation. So yeah, really excited to get your feedback and comments about my analysis and stuff. Right, so just to give a quick sort of background to Singapore, we used to be part of the British Empire as like a colony. It's only in 1963 that we became part of the Federation of Malaysia, and in joining that federation, sort of gained independence from the British. However, that sort of tenure or like that stint as part of the federation was very short-lived. We're part of, because it only lasted for 2 years. And then we separated from Malaysia and became the Republic of Singapore in 1965. However, we still see the effects of that sort of colonial administration even till today. So a good example would be the sort of racial, ethnic demographics that we see in contemporary Singapore. During the British administration, there was a high sort of demand of labor, which meant that sort of laborers were recruited from other British colonies, especially from southern China and India. So this led to a shift in demographics from the indigenous population and Malays from the surrounding Malay world in Indonesia and Malaysia, or what is now known as Malaysia, to sort of a Chinese majority nation. And so when the Singapore state was formed, it inherited this a majority ethnic Chinese nation. So at present, the state continues to maintain this majority through immigration policies by encouraging immigration from the People's Republic of China. This also sort of justifies or legitimizes a siege mentality where Singapore's security is sort of perceived as precarious and never taken for granted because we are a Chinese majority country in the Malay world, and like Malays are constantly hoping to attack us. Obviously, there are historical sort of events that have led to sort of the justification of the siege mentality, but yeah, I won't go into that today. So in general, social governance is through a racial or ethnic lens. What is known as ethnicity outside of Singapore is normally is sort of termed as race in Singapore. So today during the presentation, there might be like I would use the terms interchangeably, but obviously there are implications for the understanding of ethnicity as race, and I welcome questions about this later. But anyway, yeah. So social governance mainly through race, and we follow the CMIO model, which stands for Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other. So yeah, like race is something that is really central to participating in the public sphere. Oftentimes, if you're filling out a form, you have to put your race on your identity card. Yeah, like which race you are. Like it's written, so it's codified and formalized. Just a quick note on what other means. Just basically anyone who doesn't fall neatly into category of Chinese, Malay, or Indian. Right. So the next slide. Yeah. So in terms of citizenship making practices, really the two twin sort of coupling of the two national ideologies, multiculturalism and meritocracy. It really forms the crux of political logic and governance in Singapore. It also plays a central role in constructing ideas of what it means to be Singaporean and ideas of citizenship and national belonging. Because multiculturalism in Singapore is understood as, sort of inequality among between all ethnic groups or racial groups, it obfuscates any sort of ethnic inequalities, right? And it works together with meritocracy to uphold that image, because meritocracy sort of dictates, I guess, that it's everyone is judged based on individual merit. At the same time, you have this very neoliberal sort of context that meritocracy and multiculturalism operate in, where there is a privileging, or rather, a prioritization and political commitment to economic progress and development, which is framed through the rhetoric of national survival. So Singapore, we would always need to progress or like have constant economic development, because that's the only way that we can survive as a nation state. So meritocracy and multiculturalism, they work in tandem as a form of social control and governmentality. So it legitimizes the incumbent government's control over its electorate, and at the same time, it obfuscates any sort of structural inequalities which have arisen due to historical political decisions and state policies. So I explain later on I'll give examples of what I mean by historical political decisions in the later slides. Right. So very quickly, this is the typical life course of like a Singaporean man. In terms of citizenship-making practices, these stages of one's life really coincide with different sort of arenas where citizenship is sort of made or constructed. So if you're a Singaporean man, you have to serve 2 years of national service. It's basically mainly military conscription. When you're 18, some people start at 19. And then when you're done after 2 years, you would be part of the reserve unit. That's what it means to be operationally ready. And then for the next 20 years of your life, 20 to 30 years of your life, you have to go for a refresher military training course for 2 weeks every year. And then after that, most people, depending on whether or not they get to university, most men would have their first employment, first job between 25 to 29 years old. They get married around the age of 30. And you will see that in this graph, I also included home ownership as a life stage. And it's because, so in Singapore, unlike in the UK, for example, more than 70% of the population live in public housing. And access to public housing really is predicated on your citizenship status. It's basically for mostly Singapore citizens and permanent residents. But yeah, for permanent residents, I think the requirements are slightly different. So it's mainly for citizens, and it's also predicated on your marital status. Excuse me. So if you're single, you cannot buy a public flat, public housing until you're 35. The only way that you can buy earlier than 35 is if you're married, and you are required to sort of show proof of marriage, as in your marriage certificate, when you get your keys to your public housing flat. And obviously, you get the maximum amount of subsidies from the government if you are a married couple who live close to your parents, for example. So yeah, there are all these sort of policies that come together to really privilege and prioritize the heteronormative couple. In Singapore, just side note, gay marriage isn't recognized. So if you're a gay couple, you still have to wait till you're 35 in order to qualify. I mean, if you're a gay couple who are both citizens of Singapore, you have to wait till you're 35. Yeah, and even then there are really a lot of complications because, yeah, like who owns a flat and stuff like that. Right, so as I was saying earlier about national service, men would have to go to reservist training until they're either between 40 to 50 years old, where they would be they would be done with that reservist training and they would be taken off the reserve unit. Okay. So because there are these stages, life stages that have to they have a close relationship or intimate relationship with citizenship-making in Singapore. I wanted to recruit participants who had interacted with at least like one or two of those arenas and spheres, and that's why I sort of recruited men who are between 25 to 50 years old, and also I only focus on straight men. So in the end, I recruited 30 men from varying ethnicities, Chinese, Indian, Malay, and even though I did try to widen that sort of age bracket or age group, most of my participants were in their late 20s and 30s. I conducted 1 to 2 rounds of interviews, each lasting 1.5 to 2 hours, and conducted them between November 2020 and September 2021, both online, over Zoom, and in person because of the pandemic and the complications from that. So the interview questions really related to sort of the different life stages that I showed early on in the previous slide. And because in these different life stages, it sort of corresponded with different masculine roles, like like being a father, being a worker, being a husband, and things like that, and being a soldier, I decided to focus on these sort of experiences in my interviews. Because of time constraints in today's presentation, I will be focusing only on schooling and national service. But if anyone has any questions about how that, about other arenas of citizenship, such as marriage or the family and work, you're welcome to, I welcome questions on those. Yeah. And next slide. Right, so finally into my data findings. So my findings demonstrate that in everyday interactions, in school especially, boys are socialized into particular ways of being Singaporean boys, which challenges the ideas of racelessness and genderlessness that, you know, so the school system in Singapore purportedly engenders. So one of the ways this is sort of contradictions. One of the ways in which contradictions and tensions that challenges this sort of multicultural meritocracy is through elite secondary schools. So in Singapore, elite secondary schools are oftentimes single-sexed. So they're either all boys or all girls, and they're predominantly Chinese. So even though it's not that sort of to qualify for these schools, you have to be ethnically Chinese, it has to do more with the language policy in Singapore, where it's conflated with one's ethnicity. So these elite schools only offer Mandarin as a second language, or what we call mother tongue. And because all students are expected to do both their first language, which is English, and just mother tongue, you have a situation where non-Chinese students do not or cannot qualify for enrollment into these schools because they are required to take a mother tongue language that isn't Mandarin. Obviously, there are other complications, for example, whether or not even for Chinese Singaporeans, do they speak Mandarin at home? Most of them don't actually. So then, yeah, there's a whole lot of complications. But anyway, so these are, this is an example of policy actually creating barriers to entry for non-Chinese Singaporeans. Right, so how this self-manifests in experiences of Singaporeans in everyday life is through the sort of contradictions in understanding how whether or not meritocracy actually works. And what I mean by this is it sort of is exemplified in how Kai, so this is an excerpt from an interview with Kai, who's 26, he's Chinese, and he's currently doing a postgraduate degree in the UK. So when I asked him whether or not he thinks that meritocracy works in Singapore, he said that, you know, he can't really comment because he only did his undergraduate there. It was interesting that he only focused on like university as opposed to like earlier schooling. But as he was saying, you know, it's purely by merit, right? So he's saying that meritocracy works. He, you know, thinks that, yeah, women and men are have equal opportunities. And in Singapore, it's not about the gender, it's not about race, it's namely about how well-to-do your family is or was doing. Yeah, so he's basically talking about class inequality, right? So even though at the beginning of the anecdote, he says, you know, it's purely by merits, but what does that actually mean in actuality is that, you know, he thinks that, yeah, like if your family is well-to-do or based on your family's socioeconomic status, you might actually have more opportunities or have, yeah, advantages in the system, which directly challenges ideas of meritocracy, right, and whether or not it works in Singapore. So, as I said, there is a tension or contradiction between what Kai is saying about the centrality of merits in Singapore and what he argues in terms of the influence one's family wealth can have on a child's education in future. So what was interesting, I guess, is why he doesn't see, so yeah, that there's this sort of dissonance between what he understands to be meritocracy and what he also thinks is happening in real life, or like at the ground, on the ground, right? And then when I asked him about his own experiences, actually I just asked him whether or not in his high school, or what we call junior college in Singapore, whether or not there are Malays in junior college. This was his response, where he became really uncomfortable with talking about it, and he didn't really answer my question. And then he justifies his lack of sort of comment about the matter as, it might be biased, it's subjective, and what was interesting is because of the previous, like what he was saying in terms of meritocracy, there was also a sense of, this reluctance to challenge official discourse, right, about what Singaporean society looks like, where, all races are equal, and no one particular group is privileged. At the same time, there is undeniably like stereotypes that come together with, racial stereotypes about Malays and Indians, and actually also the Chinese, right? Where the Chinese are often seen as hardworking and stuff, as opposed to Malays and Indians. So that's sort of the backdrop in which these ideas about meritocracy and multiculturalism exist. So when I started talking to my Malay and Indian participants, a sort of image of what's really happening on the ground has definitely is quite different from how my Chinese participants would talk about growing up. So Rahim was talking about how culture sensitivity in Singapore, or basically what he means by culture sensitivity is just cultural knowledge, right? It goes one way, right? So as a Malay, he knows a lot about Chinese cultural practices like tomb sweeping, or like he's just giving examples now. And he's really learned all of these things through what he terms as osmosis, because it's everywhere. And essentially what he's pointing towards is that, society, the blueprint for society is Chinese, right? And that's why even if you're non-Chinese, you will learn about Chinese sort of cultural practices, and you will inherit to some extent Chinese cultural knowledge. But it's not quite the same for like Chinese Singaporeans, who will not learn about Malay culture, or they won't really learn about the Malay community or the Indian community, right? So Rahim's metaphor of osmosis is really intriguing, because it paints a picture where Chineseness is almost omnipresent in Singapore, right? And yeah, as I said, they almost inherit Chinese cultural knowledge, even if they're not Chinese, because of how society and specifically how schooling is constructed and framed. So obviously racialization goes beyond just osmosis. It's also a very embodied experience for many of my participants who are not Chinese. So Subra, who studied one, an Indian, he I realized that there's a mistake in the text. But anyway, so he has experiences of being targeted by teachers because he's a brown boy who, growing up, was taller than everyone in class, and that kind of made him even more he stood out even more, right? And he's saying that, like, he is a very confident person because he, from the time when he was a child, he was that tall brown Indian boy, and he would always be selected and targeted by the teacher. He says, like, if the whole class was talking, the teacher would be like, Subra, why are you talking so much? And so he justifies his own sort of confidence because of his experiences growing up as a racialized boy in school. And so this is David, who's 27, Indian, and he sort of talks about similar things about not wanting to stand out, right? And he says that and a consequence of being racialized or standing out when he was in school is that to this day he doesn't keep facial hair, and he thinks a lot of it is due to him not wanting to be like the other people in his school who are, you know, during puberty, some of them will have a mustache growing, especially when they are much younger, before all the other Chinese students or Chinese boys started growing hair. And so he actively shaved and ensured that he didn't have any hair because he didn't want to be seen as another brown boy. And so you see a lot of this sort of embodied experiences of othering and difference, and that shapes, you know, how they sort of how they construct their own masculinity, right? Where, for example, David, even as an adult, doesn't want to have facial hair because he associates that with a non-Chinese masculinity that is stigmatizing. Also, schooling or these constructions of masculinity in schooling also connect to is embedded in discourse surrounding you know, sort of into transnational disparities on transnational migration. So I explain a little bit of what this means. So Alex is an Indian, Filipino, Singaporean. He went to an all-male, all-boy Catholic missionary secondary school. And he, growing up, experienced bullying and stereotyping because he is half Indian and half Filipino. So his father is Indian, his mother is Filipino. So he says, being half Indian, people think, you know, Bangla. And Bangla is a term that's really quite derogatory in Singapore. And then people sort of go up to him when he was in school, and it says things like, oh, your father met your mother at Orchard Towers. So this is like a stereotype where, you know, South Asian male migrant workers who are often working in the construction industry, sort of they meet, you know, Filipino sex workers or domestic workers at Orchard Towers, which is this building that's known for being a space where sex work happens, right? So you sort of see this class and gendered and racialized sort of experience of bullying that Alex has from when he was growing up. And then he starts to sort of justify that, you know, he wasn't really affected by that because, you know, he would start fighting for himself and standing up for himself. And so retaliation in the form of violence then becomes justified to a large extent because of these sort of innate bodily constituents such as testosterone. You know, it's a classic boys will be boys moment. Yeah. So moving on to national service, which in the next couple of slides, I will show how it's actually still connected to schooling, or rather it's a continuation of the sort of dynamics, power dynamics that we see in sort of schooling. So as I said earlier in the presentation, every Singaporean man has to go through national service. Sorry. And they would normally, well, men would be sort of directed to like different institutions within the national service. So there's the Singapore Armed Forces, the Singapore Civil Defence Force, and the police force. So historically, even though Malays were very much part of the armed forces, they were removed from the armed forces because they were seen as a potential threat to national security, as I said earlier. And this sort of removal of Malays from the armed forces sort of happened after independence. It's also known that non-Chinese men are overrepresented in the Civil Defence Force and the police force, right? Obviously, this has implications for future career opportunities because the military is still seen as the most prestigious. And if you get sent to like the Civil Defence Force or like the police force, it's kind of like, you know, it doesn't have the same sort of prestige or esteem as the military. So for today's presentation, I will focus only on participants who were enlisted in the military as opposed to the civil defense force and police force. But yeah, so as I was saying, national service is a space that is highly tiered. Men are differentiated by their educational levels and their ethnicity. So if you're Malay, you most probably will not be sent to the military, but then also if you didn't go to high school, then you would be enlisted at a different time compared to other men. And yeah, it also means that your opportunities to become an officer, for example, is almost non-existent if you don't have like high school qualifications. So as I was saying, there's definitely a continuation of these sort of relations of power, and they perpetuate social inequalities, right? So Xavier is 41. He is he's Chinese, and he was in the military. He went to a very elite high school. In fact, his secondary school and his high school, and actually his entire academic trajectory has been, you know, just constantly, it's very elite, right? And so when I asked him about his experiences in the military, you know, he described the first 3 months of basic military training as, you know, sort of being put together with people of the same background. And when he says background, he really just means sort of educational background, right? And similar age. And then he goes on to say that, you know, after BMT, when he's posted to the specific units, he starts to interact with people from different social backgrounds. Sorry, different education experiences. And so he starts to sort of acknowledge, right, that he went to more elite schools, which meant that most of the people there, they tend to be nicer, they tend to be more truthful, and was only in the army that he started coming into contact with very unpleasant people. And so you sort of see that conflation between class and moral character. But as we know earlier on from an earlier slide, that these elite schools oftentimes are very Chinese spaces, right? So this, so Xavier never actually had interactions with people who are not Chinese until he went to the army, right? So then it also brings up questions of like racial stereotyping and yeah, just barriers to certain spaces for non-Chinese Singaporeans. So this is another example of how meritocracy sort of justifies intra-ethnic class disparities and also inter-ethnic class disparities, right? So Anthony is another Chinese Singaporean who went to all the elite schools, right? And he became an officer in, so Xavier also became an officer in the military. Sorry, I'm just gonna quickly check if I have time. Okay, I couldn't see the time earlier. Yes, so I've got about 5 minutes. I'm gonna hurry. So yeah, Anthony, as an officer, he starts talking about how, you know, people, a lot of the people in his unit were actually very well educated, but, you know, there were some who weren't as educated. So he describes them as abing, which is a colloquial term for a Chinese gangster. And, you know, the way he describes them is like talking about how they pose a problem or they pose a challenge to his authority as an officer, right? Where, you know, he describes them as like people who are very aggressive or like emotional and unable to control their own emotions, and, you know, sort of that was something that he had never handled before. So also as a reflection of his very privileged background, where, you know, he's just really been in these very elite spaces, which also meant that he's never met like a working class man, right? So then he attributes the sort of aggression to being not as educated as him. So this is Rahim's story, where he, as a Malay in the military, he self-experienced this sense of being discriminated against, or at least not given the same opportunities as men from who are Chinese. So when I asked him about his experiences, he was basically a driver. He was sent to the driver unit, right, which isn't a position that is highly sought after or seen as very prestigious in the military. And so he says, when he was, that age, he was a lot less Malay than he was Chinese. So you do see this juxtaposition between Chineseness and Malayness, where Malayness, because it's such a stigmatizing attribute, he had wanted to be more Chinese, essentially, or be less Malay, I guess. And anyway, so he was saying that as a driver, the other Malays around him, they were, they were not even the conventional Malay. They were, they didn't go to high school. They weren't very well educated. They were married at 21. They had kids when they were 21. They were in gangs, in and out of jail. And what was really interesting was that he said that he didn't understand the Malay that they spoke, because it was so colloquial in that sense, right? Whereas he, being more educated, going to high school and stuff like that, he couldn't connect to them. So he felt really out of place. And he started talking about how there were Chinese guys also in the driver unit who were full of tattoos, and so these guys were really affiliated with the gangs. And, they were not, they were seen as less disciplined because, they would often go AWOL and things like that. And so that experience opened his eyes to like the racial dynamics in Singapore, because there were also Chinese high school graduates in his unit or in his platoon, but the reason why they were there was because they were injured. So if you graduated from high school, you wouldn't be sent to the driver's unit. You would be sent to a more prestigious unit. But the only reason why they were there was because they were injured, right? So it was almost like they were not physically able to, participate in a more prestigious position. And then so he says he recognizes that people are segregated in a way where you'll never get a good impression of Malay people in NS or in the military, because all the Malays that you end up seeing are the Malays that he's describing as, not even normal Malays or conventional Malays. Yeah, they are these guys, right? So that was interesting. So you see from what Rahim was saying, but also Xavier and Anthony, is that there is this recognition that Malays, regardless of status, are sent to these less prestigious roles or less prestigious units compared to Chinese men. And there is definitely intersection of class, race, and masculinity, because you see how, these conventional Malays versus, those Malays that he interacted with in the unit, they are sort of talked about, described in a language that sort of stigmatizes them and sort of deviantizes them, because they were not as educated and they didn't sort of follow the usual life course of like, getting married after you found a job or whatever. They got married young, they had children young, and they had their involvement with gangs, and they were sent to jail and stuff like that. And so you do see this construction of middle classness, and its conflation, first of all, with Chineseness, and how that leads to how that actually forms a sort of mechanism of othering that others not Chinese men in Singapore. So very quickly, yeah, then so the next 2 slides will be the self-discussion section. So as I said earlier, social institutions such as schools and national service, together with work and family, they are sites through which forms of intersectional citizenship are experienced and also constructed. And these institutions converse with each other, iterating and reiterating notions of citizenship and Singaporeanness throughout this life course of the typical life course of Singaporean men. And as we saw, multiculturalism and meritocracy, they serve to uphold or produce, perceived raceless and genderless citizens, while in actuality, social infrastructure shaped by social policies engender the opposite, right? Especially when ethnicity, class, and masculinity intersect in tiered systems of citizenship. Constructions of masculinities often follow the same or similar hierarchicized logics of power. So at the same time, because of the hegemony, or what some scholars see as doxa of meritocracy and multiculturalism, it becomes really difficult to articulate experiences of differential citizenship. And it compels some of the participants from this research project to adhere to idealized forms of citizenship and to subscribe to ideologies of national belonging, which is oftentimes very much coded in Chineseness, right? And so in these situations, divergence from these ideal forms are coded either as individual failure or essentialized cultural attributes. What I mean by this is that because Chineseness is conflated with middle classness, Chinese men from working class families are there isn't a grammar that sort of sees them as collective, there isn't a cultural a language of culture that sort of collectivizes them and homogenizes them, right? Because Chineseness is middle classness. So these Chinese men from working class families, they are oftentimes sort of their poverty and their marginalization is seen as an individual fault, right? At the same time, Malayness is already codified through language of poverty and seen as a cultural attribute. So any exception to the rule, people like Rahim, for example, they are understood as a success story and reaffirms myths of multiculturalism and meritocracy. So I guess then it raises questions of whether or not another way of doing things in Singapore is possible, especially if there's a lack of language surrounding that helps to articulate these inequalities, but also at the same time, any discussion that sort of counters multiculturalism and meritocracy is immediately shut down. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. That was really, really great. Okay, I'll open up to any questions. I've got a couple, but we'll see if anyone else wants to go first. You can put your hand up and come on the mic, or type in the chat if you'd prefer. Eva, was that a hand? My thing's being weird, sorry, so I can't think.
Yeah, so hi. So yeah, sorry, my computer is slow. So thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, I think my question is not particularly theoretical, but I've been thinking about some parallels, like of another like British colony, like which is Hong Kong, where I'm from, like because you talk about like how the whole intersection of class and race is kind of like intertwined through the education system in Singapore, like through like implementing Chinese as the essential, Mandarin as the essential second language, exclude a lot of non-Chinese students, which is something I also see similar in Hong Kong, which exclude a lot of South Asian and Indian students, ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, which imply class mobility, etc. And I'm just wondering, in the context of Singapore, like that state-imposed Chinese centrism, I mean, I guess this is a more like empirical contextual question, but I'm just wondering, like, how is there any people actually call that out? I know that might be a stupid question, but I'm just thinking that's very blunt Chineseness imposed or Han Chinese centrism imposed through government in all aspects. I mean, some of them may be geopolitically like considered like excluding Malay, but I'm just wondering if there's anyone raised that at all. And in terms of, I mean, technically you still have to maintain the ratio of different groups. So I'm just wondering, like, in terms of political sphere or any NGOs or lobbying groups, how is the discussion like in Singapore, like currently?
Thank you, Eva, for that question. It's not a stupid question. I think, yeah, so you're right that there are people who have been raising that and stuff, and obviously experiencing a huge backlash. So I don't know if you've heard, but there's been discussions of this concept of Chinese privilege in Singapore, where, and I think the South China Morning Post did cover an article on it. So yeah, so obviously they experienced a lot of backlash, and the government has categorically, they have discussed this in Parliament, and they have categorically said that there's no such thing as Chinese privilege. We're a multicultural society, blah, blah, blah. And I think that has obviously social implications because, as I mentioned in the discussion slides, it really shuts down any sort of productive conversation about race, right? And I think as a society, we are really unable to have any discussion about racism, even because multiculturalism is always that specter that haunts all of these discussions, and it serves to show, it serves as evidence, right, that sort of challenges any discussion about racism. How can there be racism if Singapore is a multicultural society? And it's obviously this kind of reminds me of Banor Hesse's article. So Hesse wrote this article about, oh no, I can't remember what's the title of the article, but I can send it to you. Essentially, it's talking about how liberal ideas of racism really doesn't, it doesn't shed light on structure, and it's unable to talk about racism as structure, right? Because racism is really just seen as something that is an individual act, and because of the Holocaust and everything else, it's seen as something that is racism is only racism if it's something that is heinous, right? And you sort of see the same sort of mechanisms happening in Singapore. But yeah, they have implications for masculinity as well, because then, as I said, if Chinese privilege doesn't exist, then racialized masculinities that are often marginalized cannot exist as well, right? So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rong?
Hi, yes, okay, great. Hi, Aerin, thanks for your presentation. I really liked it. Every time I see a presentation on Singapore, it just reminds me again of how peculiar a place it is. And this is coming from a Singaporean who also works in Singapore. So, but thanks for that. To maybe kind of draw on or extend Eva's question, right? I think what you raised at the beginning about multiculturalism and ideology, and meritocracy as kind of ideologies that were created, constructed to deal with all sorts of problems that emerge from kind of post-colonial nation state building. But in many ways, it now also creates a lot of new problems that we are dealing with, right? And I think one of the antagonisms that you raised at the end is this antagonism between Singaporeanness and kind of race, right? Chineseness, Malayness, Indianness, and I think the antagonism is interesting because it works internally and externally as well. So internally, like how you discussed, Chineseness is seen as being more Singaporean compared to Malayness or Indianness. But at the same time, in Singapore is also not immediately obvious, right? Singaporeans at the same time, they're also kind of dealing with competing accounts of Chineseness or Indianness from outside of Singapore. And this whole debate about how Chinese coming from China is sometimes mistaken as being more Singaporean than Singaporean Indians, for example. So how race plays into that. So I wonder if that kind of internal external dynamic comes into your research. It comes up in your research, in your interviews, and how that might intersect with kind of construction of masculinities, for example.
Thank you, Xiaoyong. Is that how I pronounce your name?
Yeah, you can call me wrong.
Thank you for your question. It's a really good question. So it does come up, and especially when in discussions of work. So I have a chapter on work as a site of masculinity construction, and because the sort of South Asian male migrant worker, and yeah, like they are like the sort of specter that continues to haunt Indian men, for example, and how they construct masculinity. It does come up where a lot of my participants sometimes, I remember one of my participants, he works for, he's a civil servant, and he works for this ministry that, is well known for not hiring anyone who isn't Singaporean, right? And so he was complaining to me that there was this one time where he called a cab from his workplace. And when he got into the cab, he's Indian, by the way. When he got into the cab driver thought that he was a migrant worker, and he felt really, indignant about that. Like he kind of felt like his authenticity as a Singaporean was challenged, because he was Indian, and that the cab driver was just immediately assumed, that he was a construction worker who was working on the building site next to the ministry building, right? And what really stood out to me in that interview was how he kind of connected his Singaporeanness and his claims to national belonging to his job, right, as a civil servant. And you sort of see similar things happening with Chinese Singaporeans who, I mean, it happens, like Chinese Singaporeans who also see themselves as very much cosmopolitan. So there are discussions about what it means to be cosmopolitan. That sort of goes against the grain of, sort of lower class, I guess, or working class Chinese Singaporeans, but also migrant workers from China who are in low wage jobs and who are unable, like they're seen as almost like tied to the land, which also raises another question, because who does the land belong to? Malays, indigenous population and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ron. No one else with a question? And Eva's put a reading recommendation in the chat as well about some of that, about Han centrism. Sounds very interesting. I had a question if you wanted to pick up on something you mentioned. So you said that there's a kind of a couple of case studies within this broader PhD about masculinity, and you have other kind of sites that you talk about. So I wondered if you wanted to tell us about that, and maybe also about, I don't know if this is a good question to ask a PhD student, but how the PhD is going more broadly, and how that kind of process is, and how how all that knits together, I suppose.
Thank you. So the PhD is going. Never mind. Anyway, it's just been really exhausting. As other people who are working on their PhDs or have finished their PhDs would know, I'm kind of in the point where I'm trying to put everything together. So that's quite a lot of conflicting ideas and thinking about what to include and what not to include. The perennial problem. In terms of the other sides of masculinity, so there is work, which I kind of sort of mentioned, and then there's also sort of what I term the intimate sort of institution, that is marriage and family, right? So what's really interesting about that is that the idea of family is seen as basically the family is really seen as the key site of sort of social welfare, and it's seen as like the basic unit of society, right? So when I talk about neoliberalism in Singapore, instead of seeing people as, I know I did mention that, you know, working class Chinese men are seen like their sort of failure to participate in or be oh, cat, hello cat, sorry, is, you know, they're seen as is seen as an individualized failure, but really it's more to do with the individual family that is unable to become middle class, right? And so you have a situation where the family is seen as really important, but at the same time, it's used as a way to stigmatize and marginalize Malay communities who are seen as too engaged in family relationships, and because they're so focused on the family that they're not productive in the workforce, right? So you have this really weird, and obviously, you know, it manifests in different ways, but, you know, this idea of work-life balance, right? So Chinese men are seen as too focused on their career, so they forgo their families, or they are not really forming families, right? So you have a situation where the government is now afraid that there are not enough Chinese families essentially having babies, right? And so that's why they need to rely on expats from the People's Republic of China. At the same time, Malay families or Malay men are seen as too focused on their families, and that's why they are not productive. Oftentimes you see this trope about Malay families or Malay men being, you know, too family oriented. So they have too many children for their own good. They can't afford their children to have that many children, but they go on anyway because, you know, they're really family oriented, and like, you know, they like to have like community and stuff. So it's almost like a really, I mean, if you think about it, it's almost like it has a similar grammar to like the logics of coloniality, right? Where you have a situation where people who are more, they're really constructed as more backward, you know, they're more traditional, and they are unable to sort of keep up with this sort of modern nation state, you know, and stuff. And yeah, it also has to do with their productivity. So I think, as I said in the discussion slide, there's really a conversation between different social institutions and how, you know, family then correlates with work, which also correlates with national service and, you know, one's level of schooling and things like that. And it really just perpetuates a very, whatever sort of social inequalities that come up, and that affects like how people construct their masculinity. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Laura.
It does, yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So we are nearly out of time, unless anyone's got a very urgent question. Otherwise, I'll wrap up. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was, I mean, it was just like so interesting, and links in this conversation has shown kind of how different things this really links in. Eva, did you mean, was that a hand? Did that mean to be
sorry,
a hand?
wrong hands. I meant to clap. Sorry.
That's fine. It can act as a clap. That's fine. Thank you. Good luck with your PhD. I'm sure it'll be great. It sounds really fascinating. And thanks everyone for coming and for your questions.
Thank you very much. Bye. See you all.
Bye everyone. Thanks.